Next chapter, GrownUp Children. Cornelia interrupted his ruminations with a sudden question. "Why did you leave, and why have you come back?" David was startled to hear such direct and almost demanding words from such a young girl. David answered her question with a question of his own. "Aren't you glad that I've come back?" "Yes, of course," answered Cornelia, "but that's not what I'm asking you." Again, David was taken aback at her directness, and he was also aware that his first answer to her was an attempt to avoid really looking at what he should say to her. For one thing, he felt she was too young for him to answer her truthfully. On the other hand, he had learned from grandfather that almost always a direct and honest answer was the best and clearest thing. Furthermore, he liked her curiosity, and he appreciated her directness. Perhaps she was more grown up than he had been at that age, and the only respectful thing to do was to answer her openly and honestly, and to see where it led. "I have difficulty with your questions because, for one thing, I think you may be too young to hear my answers." Again, her reply startled him. "How old do I have to be in order for you to tell me the truth?" With questions and answers like hers, he knew he had no choice but to be as honest and direct as she was being. "I have to apologize to you. You've made me aware that I've been treating you like a child, but your words aren't those that I could have asked when I was your age. You seem to be much older than I was when I was 5 years old. So I have to respect the questions you ask and tell you that I feel a bit uncomfortable answering them, but I will." "Great," Cornelia almost yelled. "Finally, someone who can answer me directly when I ask something. Mother and father are so evasive when I ask them difficult questions. They don't seem to understand that I enjoy thinking about things. It gets so tiring trying to wrestle with them in order to get an honest answer. They don't think I know when they're lying, and they don't seem to realize that I really do want to know things. I used to ask them about you, and they never wanted to answer me directly, but always talked about what a good boy you are, and how smart you are, and that you had to go to a special school. Now that you're here, I want to know directly from you, because I have all kinds of questions saved up that were never answered." David took a deep breath. The growing that had begun with grandfather and bear man in the village seemed to him to be continuing here at home with his little sister, only he was having difficulty thinking of her as little. Her questions were so direct and challenging that he started to realize that her mind was very mature, even at her young age. And he began to wonder if maybe his own mind was also mature at a young age, but that he had acceded to his parents' view that he was too young. Could it be that he had been treated like a child, and so he had learned to act like one? For he realized he had always had a yearning to grow and to evolve and to be fully whoever he was. Through Cornelia's questions, he was realizing that perhaps a mind is born mature and that it learns quite skillfully to be infantile. With this realization, he began to see his own parents in an entirely new light. Maybe they were still being the children they had learned to be, even though their bodies were that of grown-ups. What if parents are really children trying to act like they think grown-ups are supposed to act? Such a thought suddenly startled him. But this would be only an act, like putting on a play and pretending they were mature when they really weren't. David began to recognize that this had been exactly his difficulty when he had decided to leave school and to run away from home. School had been training him to put on an act of being intelligent, but he had realized that what he longed for was to really grow up. Only grandfather and bear man had helped him do this, and in many ways they were very childlike, direct, honest, questioning, and humorous. And they had really liked David. In fact, they had felt a deep love for one another. David realized that his parents and his teachers had always felt uncomfortable with his honest questions, and in fact they had evaded them just as he himself had begun to evade Cornelia's questions. So he realized that what Cornelia really needed from him was forthrightness and complete honesty. Next chapter, Conversations with Cornelia. David's thoughts and realizations about grown-ups was suddenly interrupted by Cornelia. "So, answer my question. What was your school like? And also, why are you so reluctant to tell me about it?" David was taken aback by Cornelia's vocabulary. She was using words that he didn't even know when he was her age. "Just now I was realizing that our parents are really children who are putting on an act of being adult. But I am also seeing that you're very adult, especially for your age, and I don't know how that could happen. Very early I learned that our parents use words in order to try to control, not only to control me, but to control each other as well. And I began to wonder, what are these strange noises that we call words? And why would people want to control other people? I initially tried to ask Mom and Dad these questions, but they only became confused and tried even harder to control me. They were really afraid of my questions, so I began asking my questions not to them, but just inside of myself. I would ask the question silently and just let the question begin to work in its own way. "How do you mean, to let the question work in its own way?" David asked. Well, something in me really wanted to know. But I realized that the knowing was not going to come from Mom or Dad. Not the real knowing, anyway. Their answers were often just ways of avoiding my questions, and that was frustrating. So I understood that they didn't want me to know, or else they were scared of my knowing, or maybe they themselves were scared of knowing what I was asking. So I had to ask my questions and then just watch. And since their answers were not really answers, but ways of running away from answering my questions, just became more and more silent questions. I still asked them, but not out loud. And my questions then helped me to be aware and showed me that if I waited and watched, then I would understand the answer. David was overwhelmed by the complexity of this answer from such a young child. He understood that there was a beautiful clarity in Cornelia, that she had learned to see people clearly and not only through their words and what they said, but also through what they didn't say. She was not confused by their words the way he had been as a child, but saw that she had understood early on that words were a kind of mask that many people wore. And he remembered the dances in the village when the night was dark and only fires were burning, and the dancers came out in masks, masks of animals or of demons and ogres or of other people. But inside the mask was always something else. He realized that Cornelia had also seen the dance that people do, and that the masks they wore were masks of words and language, and that if you understood they were wearing masks, you could also realize that there was a real person inside the mask, and that his parents were doing a dance without even realizing they were dancing rather than being real. And David also understood something very profound. Cornelia was very, very real. Next chapter, Real Talks. David began, "It is so refreshing to hear and see how clear you are. It was this lack of clarity that caused me to run away in the first place." "You ran away? Mom and Dad always said you'd gone off to a special school." It was a special school, a very special school, but not the kind of school that I had been used to, or that Mother and Father know about. This was a school where I was in very real situations, where I had to act and be aware, and to learn from what I did in each moment. It was not at all like the school I went to here in this town, a school where I just had to obey and to answer questions and do whatever the teacher said. "Wow, I want to hear all about it. It sounds like something I would love." "I'm sure you would love it. But you're way ahead of me. When I was your age, I believed whatever anyone told me. But luckily I had Gordy and Elephant, who always told me the truth. In fact, it was Elephant who told me that if I didn't leave school, I would be put in a cage and could never escape. I understand now that you have escaped that cage, the cage of believing the words of other people. Lots of times I don't even believe my own words, Cornelia replied, much to David's surprise. To me, words are like clothes. You try on clothes to see if they fit, and to see how they feel, and to see if you like the colors. Lots of times they don't fit, or they don't feel right, and I certainly don't go around trying on other people's clothes. I let them wear them, and I wear my own, and I don't go around showing them off. Lots of people like to parade around in their word clothes and try to force them on other people. I see Mom and Dad do that all the time. David could hardly believe his ears that such wisdom could come from such a small girl. But he was beginning to understand that Cornelia was a very special being, and he was already learning from her. David said, "But I see that you like to ask a lot of questions, so you must want to hear what other people have to say." I let my questions take me to answers in their own way, either through people or around people. And I know that people use words in strange ways, but this is the first time that I've heard that words form cages for people, Cornelia replied. Grandfather taught me that people first of all use word cages to hide in, so that other people won't hurt them, or so that others will like them. But after a while they find that they can't get out of those cages, and can't even see them anymore. It's when the cages are invisible that people are really trapped, and they feel caught in something but don't know what it is. That's when they believe that if they get other people to live in the same cages, they will feel freer. I like thinking that we have a grandfather, Cornelia almost yelled in joy. He's not really our grandfather, that's just what everyone in the village called him. Oh, I see. Those are just the clothes he wore for other people. Yes, in a way, but it was also a way that people showed their respect to him. Why was he respected? What did he do? He kind of kept an eye on what was going on in the village. He knew everyone and could feel if they were in any sort of trouble or conflict. And he went out of his way to help people understand and live in warmth and harmony with others. In a beautiful sort of way, he was the grandfather of the entire village. And he came to rescue me. He heard my call when I knew I needed to leave school and this home. You must have called real loud, Cornelia said with a smile. I didn't say a word other than to Elephant, but Grandfather heard my feelings and my desperation. He knew things that were independent of distance, and when he did something, he did it without any doubt. He just knew things without being able to explain them to others, and he trusted his knowing. But his knowing was deeper than words, and it was this kind of knowing that he knew I needed in myself. I know that place, Cornelia suddenly blurted out, and I feel that I know Grandfather also, even though you've barely mentioned him. It's like trying on word clothes. There's a place that knows whether they fit or not, and that place is deeper than the words themselves. And Grandfather feels very real to me, even though I've never met him. And I know that someday I will. Next chapter, The Village. So tell me about this village where you lived, the one that Grandfather was the grandfather of, Cornelia continued. Well, everyone in the village knew everyone else, and they all helped each other whenever there was anything that needed to be done, especially if it needed to be done quickly. Many of the people lived together in a very big house that had only one big room. That's where I slept, but other people and other families slept there too. You mean you didn't even have your own room? Well, it wasn't so necessary to have your own room there. There was lots of space around the village where you could go if you needed to be alone, and all the space was part of the village, and everyone used it whenever they needed to. There were mountains all around one side of the village, and there was an ocean along the other side, with coves and beaches, with fishing places and pools for swimming. And the mountains and the ocean were very wild, so going anywhere was always an adventure. I loved going into the forest, where I learned on my very first day there that it was better if you wore no clothes. No clothes? Wasn't that weird? What if someone saw you? First of all, the people in the village weren't concerned about nakedness. They felt it was normal for people to enjoy being naked, and there was nothing forbidden or secret about it. Everyone has a body, and I learned there to respect my own body and the bodies of other people, and not to intrude, not even by looking, and certainly not to stare. This seemed to be the basis of a deeper respect that the people had for each other. Respect for dreams that they had, or for their imagination, and also for mistakes they made. In a certain sense, people were clothed in respect, and that was much finer than any clothes you could wear. Secondly, being naked in the mountains or in the sea felt delicious. You could feel all of nature with your body, and I came to realize that nature is also naked, and that when we wear clothes, we are kind of hiding ourselves from nature, from the other animals, from the trees and the plants and the flowers. They like to smell us as much as we like to smell them. And the animals seemed to trust me much more if I was naked. Wearing clothes in the mountain came to feel like I was hiding myself in some way. And besides that, my skin came to feel much more alive. I realized that my body knew lots of things, like seeing with your skin and knowing what was present all around you. But didn't you get cold? After I got used to it, being cold wasn't something to be avoided. It actually felt good and sparkling and alive. Of course, if it was dangerously cold, we had blankets and furs we could wear, but that was only when it was close to freezing. And these were the blankets and skins that we also slept in, so they began to feel like friends rather than like something hung in a closet. It sounds really exciting and different. I would love it, but I can't imagine Mom or Dad being able to live there. They have so many rules about everything. We can't even be naked here in our own house. Even when it's real warm and I feel like just wearing my panties or my pajamas, Mom always says, "Put something on. What if someone came to the door?" She seems to be really scared of what might happen, especially if it involves other people. I could never understand why she's so focused on other people who aren't even here. Was she that way when you lived here? Oh yes, she was more aware of what could possibly happen than she was of what was going on right now. And it always seemed like she was surrounded by people who weren't here, and she was really concerned about what they might think. In the village, people were very present with whatever was happening right then and there. And they might think about possibilities, but they realized that these were just their thoughts, rather than something that was really going to happen. They were profoundly present, rather than lost in their thinking. But they were also very open and honest with each other, and they laughed a lot. They seemed to always find something funny to laugh about, and they always loved to play. Grown-ups here just don't play. They might go to a game and watch someone else play, but it always seemed to be much more serious than playing to them. In the village, people could play spontaneously as well as being serious when that was needed. Looking back right now, I see that the people in the village seem to be much more alive than anyone in this town has been. "It sounds like great fun," said Cornelia wistfully. "When can we go there?" Next chapter, The Cage of Thinking. Just then Mother returned, and David and Cornelia were surprised that it was already noon. They were not aware that any time had passed, and they looked at each other strangely when Mother asked what they had been doing all morning. "We've just been talking," Cornelia answered. "David told me all about the school where he lived." David looked curiously at Cornelia and then at Mother. "Yes, we would like to hear more about your school also when Daddy arrives," Mother said. It was strange to hear his mother call his father Daddy. It sounded so childish. He didn't remember ever having heard her call him that before. "Yes, I'll tell you about it," David answered nervously, not really knowing what he was going to say to them. He knew he couldn't talk to them as openly as he had to Cornelia about the village, but Mother also gave a hint of being in no hurry to hear about it. He felt she was divided. Part of her was very curious about where he had been, and a part of her was terrified to hear about his adventures. He felt she really wouldn't have a place within herself for the story he might tell, and that there was no room in her that could accommodate his new self. She was juggling her understanding about this new, mature stranger that she should know. After all, she had given birth to him, and he had lived with her for 11 years of his life, but he was now too big and other for him to have a place within the ideas she had about what the world was like. Cornelia also noticed the quickness of her movements and of her statements, as if she were hurrying herself in order not to have to stretch her mind in an unknown way in order to be able to house a new and strange story in it, a story that she would have difficulty telling her friends and neighbors. She was trying to fit David into the story he had occupied in her thinking, but he would no longer fit, and it would be terrifying to stretch her story of who she was in order to have room for this strange man now. Cornelia suddenly understood the cage of thinking that David had spoken about, and saw clearly how her mother was trapped in it. And a curious idea popped into her head about how she could help. His school was called the Village, Cornelia said, addressing her mother, and it was a model of the way community might evolve. He was studying possible ways people might live together in a crowded world. David was shocked. First of all, at the way Cornelia used words so skillfully, and secondly, at the bright idea he could see she was developing. David saw immediately that Cornelia knew the map of ideas in which Mother lived, and that she was using words that would fit into their mother's map of reality, so that she would not have to stretch her perspective very much in order to understand a short story of where David had been for the past 5 years. "Yes," added David, "it was a model for a futuristic school." Mother nodded and looked relieved, and it was obvious that she had heard enough for the moment in order to be at ease. David suddenly recalled Grandfather's meeting with the principal of his school when he first arrived to take David to the village, and Grandfather's answer when David had asked him what he had said to the principal. "Your principal is a minor functionary, a cog in a system that is frozen. All I needed to do was push a few buttons in his thinking, and he filled in the blanks. He was totally confused and was struggling to hold his thinking together so it would make sense the way it always had to him." Next chapter, Mother Again. David was rather surprised that Mother had not asked more questions now that the topic of his school had been opened by Cornelia. He had thought that she would be curious to hear every detail, but she actually seemed relieved to have these few bits of information that Cornelia had supplied that seemed to be sufficient for her. Or was it perhaps that having some information, she really didn't want to know more? The information she had was safe information, and she didn't want to hear things that would be difficult for her to package into her already organized thinking. David had never before recognized what a rigid woman his mother actually was, and he was flooded with questions about her. Where was her curiosity? Where was her interest? Where was her spontaneous aliveness? David had grown so used to having people around him in the village that were beautifully alive and responsive, people who could joke and play and be fully present as well as being able to seriously discuss whatever was happening. David was recognizing what a bleak home he had left, and how full the village was of vital people who always helped him remain profoundly present. He was beginning to feel that his mother and father were in fact half dead, and limited to a world of fixed thinking that had been cast years before, in fact frozen long before he had been born. Had he actually been born into a dead world? A world killed by the repeated thinking that people had learned and just repeated over and over? Where was their aliveness? Did they not miss it? Or had it been buried for so long that it was actually threatening when it began to show itself? He realized now that his return was very threatening to his own parents. Only Cornelia was alive, really alive, and profoundly present to him. How had she managed to survive in her aliveness, living with parents that were so dead? But another thought quickly entered his mind. He began to realize that he had also been very dead when grandfather had rescued him, and that Bear Man and grandfather and the people in the village had helped him to return to his own aliveness, an aliveness that he had not even realized had been severely limited by the world that he had grown up in here at home. And how many children were actually born into a world that was not really alive, and to which they were required to sacrifice their aliveness in order to perpetuate the patterns of that dead and predictable world. What was the trade-off? What was so valuable to the children that they were willing to sacrifice the thing that he had begun to realize was the most precious thing in the world, their own aliveness? Next chapter, the trade. That same evening, after father had returned from work, and the family had eaten their evening meal almost in silence, but with the usual small talk that he remembered so well, his parents had retired to the living room to watch the evening news on TV. David and Cornelia remained in the kitchen, having offered to wash and dry the dishes, and David had spontaneously asked Cornelia, "Do you watch the news also?" David remembered having watched the evening news with mother and father, but finding it either shocking or extremely boring. Father always loved the sports section, and mother was interested in any news about food and cooking. David was now understanding how limited their realms were. Cornelia surprised David with her answer. "I think the news is horrible. I would rather read or talk to my dolls and to Jessie. At least they respond when I talk to them. When Mom and Dad are watching the news, they don't like it when anyone else says a word. And they don't even talk back to the news. They just sit there like zombies." "That's an interesting description of them, zombies. Why do you call them that?" "Because they're alive, but they act like they're dead. Zombies are the living dead. And when the news is on, Mom and Dad are stuck to it like it was alive, but they aren't. It's kind of scary, actually." "But don't they talk to each other about the news?" David asked. "No, each one is interested in something different, and they don't share their interests. They really act like they're dead to each other. I used to enjoy being with them. They were funny and talked to me a lot, but then they got quieter and quieter and stopped reacting to things I would say. Why do people do that? Why do they become dead? Are only children really alive? And what happens to turn alive children into dead grown-ups?" "Your questions and observations remind me that grandfather knew what happened in our towns, and that was why he came for me. He knew I wasn't completely dead yet, but that I soon would be if I remained here any longer. Elephant knew that also. That is why he told me I would have to leave school. And then I realized I could not leave school without also leaving home. And the very next morning grandfather was waiting for me, saying that he had heard my call. But I hadn't called him. I didn't even know he existed. But somehow he must have known that I existed, and that my own aliveness would soon disappear, unless something was done. So he came to rescue me." "But how could he hear you from so far away?" Cornelia asked, looking very puzzled. I don't understand it either, David replied. He told me that everything is connected, but that we have to be tuned into the channel for knowing the connection. If we try to do everything only with our thinking, then we lose the connection to that channel. He also told me that we think we're safe in our thinking, and that we go there in order to feel safe, but we're not really safe. In fact, we're more vulnerable than ever, because we've given up one way of knowing for the sake of another. And we actually need everything we have in order to really know. So have Mom and Dad given up the way of knowing that keeps them connected? And so now they each live in their own disconnected worlds, but they think they live with each other in the same world? Did they trade their connection for the safety of their own thinking? And why would they do that? And have they left their connection with us also? And is that what we're talking about right now? But why would a person do that? I feel my connection with you very loud and clear, and that is why I was so very happy when you came back home. I knew that I would be able to talk to you, and that you would be able to hear me. And what is that connection that I feel with you anyway?